latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Morning, Dan Proft here, and did the dam just break when it comes to these individuals who, in my view, in the medical profession, who have been mutilating children? That's my view on the topic. I'm talking about this civil case in which Fox Varian sued her Westchester, New York area psychologist and plastic surgeon for the gender transition mastectomy she got at the age of 16. She won a $2 million judgment against those doctors who, she said, really pushed her into transitioning. She's now detransitioned. Interestingly, well, there's a couple of things that are interesting about this and the politics of it. One is, lest anyone forget, nearly every Democrat voted no on banning trans procedures for minors. The House, when they passed the Protect Child's Innocence Act, 216 to 211, 207 Democrats voted against it because gender-affirming treatments are, quote-unquote, life-saving. Only 3 Democrats broke ranks to vote yes. 3. That's the party, and they own this. Would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter and vice versa? All of their agitprop in defense of these ghoulish procedures and the financing of them. Something that may be a cultural issue below the fold, but still could have important impact on the midterm elections and going forward as perhaps more of a reckoning is coming, political reckoning, in addition to a legal one for many who were practicing those dark arts in the medical profession. It came up in a hearing, Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley brought it up in his back and forth with Ted Sarandos, who is the CEO of Netflix. Hawley wanted to know, and then the talk is about the Netflix effort to acquire Warner Brothers. So setting aside that for a second, Hawley focused on Netflix content that is directed towards minors, and none too happy about the pro-trans propaganda, he would say, that populates on Netflix.
That so much of Netflix content for children promotes a transgender ideology. Almost half of your content for children, I'm talking about minor children now, I'm not talking about teenagers, minor children, promotes a transgender ideology agenda. I was just looking at the data here from your various series. And what concerns me is, just 2 days ago, a jury in New York awarded a former transitioner $2 million because she said that her psychologists and others pressured her into, they pushed on her an ideology that proved to be extremely detrimental. I'm sure you know that in the UK, the National Health Service in the UK has said that they're not going to perform transgender surgeries or any longer so-called gender-affirming care for minors, including in counseling, because it is so incredibly detrimental. Our own HHS has come forward with similar findings this past year, yet if you turn on Netflix, you'll find that an enormous amount, and I say this as a parent with 3 young children, an enormous amount of your children's programming has this ideology and agenda in it. Is this an advocacy position for Netflix? Is this an ideological commitment you have? I mean, why is this?
Senator Hawley, Netflix has no political agenda of any kind. I would tell you that.
Well, then why is your children's program so full of this highly sexualized, highly controversial agenda? I don't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it went on from there. Sarandos didn't really have a good answer other than to say there are, parental controls and there's a diversity of content from which parents can make decisions in terms of what their kids and families watch and so forth. But not a good. But it's just interesting that pendulum is swinging here, and you have some professional medical associations, Plastic Surgeons Association, that are walking back from gender transitioning surgeries. Even the AMA is pressing the pause button. Very interesting in terms of potential political impact. David Drucker, it's one of the things he's written about recently. He's a senior writer for The Dispatch and author of In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
So on this matter of so-called trans rights, you penned a piece saying that basically Dems are going to have to confront this. Let the record reflect, as I mentioned, the House vote on that legislation, and not to mention all of the receipts in terms of what has been said and what has been advocated, and the mau-mauing of people who opposed gender transition, puberty blockers, and so on and so forth for minors. There's a reckoning potentially coming here.
I think it all depends on how, and I look at this more in the context of a presidential election, because midterm elections, you have different candidates in different districts and states, and they'll often sort of fit themselves or are fits for the politics in the regions that they're running in. But when you're looking at a presidential contest, I think that's where Democrats, if they want to be successful, or at least limit their self-imposed political challenges, need to recognize that, whatever the far left of the Democratic base may prefer on transgender rights, it's different than where a majority of voters are, including center-left voters, particularly on issues of how this involves children, but also transgender women playing girls' sports.
Yeah, it's interesting. Newsom had that sit down with Ben Shapiro a couple of weeks back, and sort of agreed to disagree, but was certainly trying to soften his position as compared to the one he was taking a couple of years ago, and what he did legislatively in California. Whereas, for example, Governor Pritzker here in Illinois, who James Carville says is going to be the nominee. Okay. Not so much. And not only, taking a strident position on it, but also he and the family very involved in underwriting some of the things that now you have medical professionals and professional associations walking away from.
Yeah, here I think, what my reporting has shown, and I've looked into this both for stories for the Dispatch and my Bloomberg opinion column, is that number one, Democrats need to have an opinion on this, right? I mean, one of the issues, one of the challenges they ran into in 2024 is that often Democratic candidates, particularly Vice President Harris, in the 24 campaign versus the 2020 campaign, just tried not to talk about it and tried to claim it was a Republican wedge and,
Right.
something Republicans invented that nobody cared about. Well, first of all, when you're running for president, when there's a major issue that Americans talk about and have opinions about, the first hurdle to get over is you got to have something to say. Because if you don't have something to say, you're going to get dinged more than if you have something to say they disagree with. So that's number one. Number two, where most Americans are, and, where a lot of the centrist Democratic strategists and groups have discovered in their research, just to take what their research shows, is that people do care about fairness and competitiveness in girls' sports. And there are particular sports, and maybe all sports, but there are particular sports, whether it's swimming or basketball or whatever, where, having been born male and having male bone structure and male strength and male size, there are people, especially if they have daughters that play competitive sports, say to themselves, hey, it's just not right to have a transgender woman also competing with our daughters and, and things like that. And the point of view is, as the research has delineated, is, hey, they can be transgendered and they should have, housing rights and civil rights and all of that. But I mean, this just makes common sense that there would be rules governing fairness and competitiveness. The other thing, of course, and it's something you were discussing, was how does the medical community deal with minors that either are or believe that they are transgendered? And, the growing sort of consensus is, again, transgender adults should have rights. They should have civil rights. They should be accepted and welcomed and treated like any other Americans treated, but that they shouldn't make irreparable changes to their bodies while they are minors. And that's one of these, what we like to call in the business 70-30 issues. And you're just much better off being on the side of the 70% in the issue than the 30% if you're looking at winning a national general election that relies on a lot of swing states that are decided very narrowly.
Right. I mean, that's just like when Holly was interviewing or questioning Sarandos from Netflix, that he kept using the phrase ideology, and that's the point here. What I think people see is that this is purely ideological. There's blinders on. There's just the majority, no common sense basis. And to try to paper over it with, it's inconclusive whether men have an advantage over women in sports and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just, come on. You're telling me that the world is flat, and that's a tough sell.
Yeah, it's a tough sell politically, just because that's not the experience that people have in their everyday lives. Now, I will say, a lot of the research shows that there's not necessarily a desire or broad support for blanket government bans. This thing is nuanced, right? But a lot of people believe that it should be decided at the local level with school districts or sports leagues, or even, at least at the state level, where you come up with these regulations based on what local voters want and what the sport is that we're talking about. I mean, is it competitive chess? I'm just making this up, but is it chess,
yes,
or is it swimming?
Right? Yes,
right. But in other words, you do not to be on the 70% side of this issue. You don't have to say the federal government should pass a law, or my state should pass a blanket law. You have to recognize, though, how people feel about this, and then allow regulations to be enacted where people believe they are necessary. And, some of the places in which Democrats have gotten themselves into trouble is saying that none of these regulations should exist at all. That there's no difference between a transgender woman and a woman, a biological woman, playing the game of, playing a physical sport. And that's where Democrats have gotten themselves into trouble. And look, part of the pressure comes from, just like, often I'll have these conversations about what the Republican base wants and, how Republicans feel pressure from the base. Democrats have a base too. And, the far left of the Democratic base doesn't want any distinctions and believes that any distinction is discrimination fomented by Republicans and, except, and in a sense, regular sort of rank and file voters that are less ideological or tricked. And that's just not the case, but it's one of those internal battles Democrats have.
Yeah, well, and when they say that and they have no answer to the question, what is a woman? It becomes a punchline. And when you become a caricature of yourself, that is not a good position to be in politically. And they have beclowned themselves on this issue, I think, as the full retreat seems to indicate. It seems to me that's an area where you continue to prosecute the case because, as you say, the base of the other party is not giving in on this. Their position has not changed, and that could be exploited in a general election.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, depending on what the other issues are. Look, I don't think this is rocket science, and I think people, particularly, look, you're a corporate leader, right? You're going to Congress, and you think you're there because, it's an antitrust hearing and all of that. But I think anybody going to Congress talking about health issues or trans issues or any other issue would just do well to say that, anybody at my company or my community that's a transgender person is welcome and accepted and should have all the same rights, and I'm happy they're there. Obviously, being born a woman and transitioning from being a man to a woman are biologically different, and, there are times when we need to account for that. Now, nobody's going to get dinged for that. Everybody's going to get mad at something. There's always somebody or some group that's mad at you for something.
Yeah.
Broad majority of Americans would be like, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right.
Based on the
Yeah.
data.
Yeah, I think that the majority of people, I mean, always want to be decent to one another. And if you're not decent to one another, then you're going to take a hit for it, and you should. I wanted to ask you something else too, just in terms of we know what the center cut issues are, and those are going to continue to play out over the course of the next 9 months. But I wonder if there is another sort of below the fold issue that could have outsized impact in terms of midterms, and even with an eye towards 28, as you were suggesting. And I go back to something we discussed a little bit earlier in the program again, the SAVE Act and this idea of voter ID for elections. It seems to that's another one of these 80-20 issues, and it just seems to me that the farmers don't have access to fax machines, sort of arguments that Kamala Harris was making about voter ID requirements don't really hold up very well to scrutiny. Is this something that, if you're a Republican strategist, you think about really trying to raise the temperature on, particularly if you're thinking about blowing the filibuster to get it through the Senate?
So a couple of things. In midterm elections in particular, these kinds of issues don't tend to make up for failures on the larger issues, or not necessarily a failure, but voters' perception that you're not getting it done. Yeah. When the economy is the number one issue, and when the issue coming up right behind it is how people feel about interior immigration enforcement because of the tactics used by ICE and the Border Patrol, something like the SAVE Act isn't going to fix things. The thing about it is there are so many issues that if you issue poll, people are going to say, I agree with this. But it doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that they're going to agree with any piece of legislation or the method in which the legislation is debated or the attempt to bring it about. Right? I remember during the Obama years when Democrats would regularly say Republicans should bring comprehensive immigration reform to the floor for a debate because a majority of Americans, 70 or 80%, say they agree with this issue and that this should happen. And, of course, Republicans were like, yeah, never mind. We don't like pieces of the bill. We don't like parts of the bill. My particular voters in my state or my district don't like the bill. So these things are not apples to apples. And in midterm elections, it's usually about the guy in the White House and his party in Congress, and are you getting it done on the top issues that I care about? Presidential elections are much more about choice and change, and that's where particular issues sometimes can help frame a candidate's entire image, and you have a better chance there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the other thing too is I can agree with you on this issue, but it doesn't mean that's the issue that's mainly animating my vote. So I agree with you about voter ID, but because I think of X, Y, and Z and these other issues, I'm voting against you. Of course that happens. I'm just thinking in part that. When things are as polarized as they are, midterm elections tend to be base plus elections. And so, and you have this sort of enthusiasm gap and Trump drop off that we've seen over the last decade when he's not on the ballot. And something like the SAVE Act maybe is a way to rally the base, who's otherwise supportive, but maybe not as enthusiastic about getting out and going down ballot as they've demonstrated in the past.
Yeah, look, I'm not necessarily going to disagree with you because the election hasn't happened yet. So let's see. My experience is that if you want to know how a midterm election in particular is going to go, just look at the vote of independents. One of the reasons why the 2022 midterm elections wasn't as bad for Democrats as we all thought it should have been and was going to be is because Democrats won independents by 2 points. So they lost the House, but not by much, and they maintained their Senate majority. If you want a good benchmark here, again, notwithstanding your arguments about base turnout, all the things you said are true, but a good way to sort of look at what we think is going to happen that's been the most reliable is look at, where are independents and their approval of the president and their opinions on the major issue driving our politics right now, which remains the economy, and to some extent, as I said, how the administration is handling interior immigration enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. David Drucker, senior writer for The Dispatch, author of the book In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. David, thank you as always. Good chat.
Anytime. Thank you.
And David joins us on Chicago's Morning Answer.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Welcome back to Ask Hasselus. I'm Weston. What's your question?
I give up. Where are they?
Who?
Employees.
What?
You say Hasselus Mattress